Today is Monday, January 9th, 2023, and this is William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. This afternoon, an ad went out from the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, and this ad went out to social media channels like Facebook, Twitter, and so on. And the ad says, "Modern technology makes the best Catholic education available to all students everywhere." Modern technology makes the best Catholic education available to all students everywhere. And obviously, I believe that. When we look back in history and see that most children never even went to school, the opportunity wasn't even available for them, it's because the costs of physically sending a child to school, supplying that child with books or whatever supplies were needed, providing for whoever it was that would be teaching him and so on, was very, very expensive. Even books, students never had books in history. They were rarely ever privately owned at all. A private library was the possession of a wealthy person, not common people. And when we compare how difficult it was for anyone to access quality education in the past, it was really the pursuit of the wealthy. Even if we look back at the saints in history and look back at the educated saints, if you actually do some historical research, you'll find that most of them came from wealthy families. And the same is true today. Many of the young men in seminaries and monasteries come from wealthy families. But the access to the best, the highest quality of Catholic education is available to such an extraordinary number of boys and girls today, men and women today, because of technology. And in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, we try very hard to help people understand that, so we don't sit around in the 21st century making excuses about education as if we're living in the 1400s. We all have access to thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars worth of study materials that were almost impossible to access throughout much of history. And there's really no excuse for our lack of study and use of the resources available. In fact, the Church taught in a recent encyclical, I forget which one it was. I think it was the one about the interpretation and study of the sacred scriptures. It explained that for anyone interested in theology to not know the classical languages, to not know the sacred languages, it's just a matter of sloth, because the study of these languages is so easily accessible today. There's really no excuse for Catholic boys, girls, men, and women to pursue the highest studies. We simply don't do it. And, I always am promoting this reality, trying to help it dawn on Catholic people. And that's why the ad goes out and says, modern technology makes the best education, the best Catholic education available to all students everywhere. And of course, we invite them to get started for free in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, where all the study materials are included. So much is available at little or no cost. It's almost hard to fathom how much is available. And one Catholic woman commented on the ad and said this, and this is what I'd like to talk about today. She said, but it comes at a price. Putting our kids online for the bulk of the day at an early age, ... Too much temptation and distraction. But it comes at a price. Putting our kids online for the bulk of the day at an early age, ... Too much temptation and distraction. Now, I hear responses like this all the time. And what I'd like to do in this talk today is I'd like to challenge this response that comes from parents. I'd like to challenge this position that Catholics take, that there's too much temptation and distraction online. I'd like to challenge this response, because I don't think it's fair to the internet. I don't think it's fair to the companies that actually work to protect us from bad information and content. I don't think it's fair to technology and what's available to make it out to be some kind of like immoral, diabolical, delusion, when it's making the writings of the Church Fathers, homilies from Catholic priests and monks all over the world, access to the activity of the Holy Father, all the writings of the saints, sacred scriptures, classical and sacred language studies, on and on and on, makes all of these treasures available to us in the comfort of our own home. And Catholics are going to try to put a spin on this like it's just some evil thing, like some temptation. Like you have to watch out because the internet's just out to get you, as if it's not making all of these study materials available. Now, this isn't a scripted talk. I didn't lay out any points or anything. I would just like to explore this response and think about it out loud, because I think it's simply an excuse to neglect studies, an excuse to not give an account for how we're using access to the resources that we have in our generation. So let's just think about it. First of all, it comes at a great price. So for all these benefits of all of these study materials and resources, the argument is that they come with a corresponding cost. So what is this cost? And the woman wrote, putting our kids online for the bulk of the day at an early age, too much temptation and distraction. My first question is, what do you mean, or what does one mean? Because this comment is just representative. I hear this quite a bit. First of all, what does it mean to, quote, put kids online? What does that mean, to put kids online? This is the first assumption in this response that's not granted. No one said anything about, quote unquote, putting kids online for the bulk of the day. No one said that. No one said that kids should be put online, as if to use the computer means that you need to be simply set in front of a computer and let loose for the entire day. No one said anything like that. No one said that. It's assumed when we recommend online studies, it's assumed that children who are at home being homeschooled with their parents would have parental supervision. Why would they not have parental supervision? So this first response that we're somehow suggesting, or it's somehow necessary that children just be put online for the bulk of the day, is simply a false response. It creates a false dilemma. And this problem really doesn't exist. We would never recommend anyone study anything before already having an orderly home environment, a daily schedule, parental supervision, etc. That's true whether it was printed materials or online materials. I mean, are kids allowed just to read books all day on their own with no supervision? Are they allowed to do anything all day with no supervision? No. We supervise our kids all the time. I can tell you what all of my children are doing at any time of the day. So this idea that to use the internet means that kids are simply unleashed onto the internet is simply a false argument, a false assumption that no one needs to practice. So that's the first, objection that I would reject. This idea that somehow there is, built into the use of online study materials, this like idle, wandering, web surfing through the bulk of the day as a part of online studies. That's not true, not necessary. And parents can take care of that by establishing an orderly schedule, setting up the children's study area in a reasonable way, and supervising the kids' activities. There's no reason why any children are loose doing anything, let alone using the internet. So that's just nonsense. I'll also say this, parents often like to try to make these arguments that the bad guys come and get them on the internet, and that's simply not true. You can go right now on your computer, go onto Google, and search an immoral term. Search something sexual. And I'm not really telling you to do this. I'm just saying hypothetically you could. And you will find that even if you type something that's profane, Google will filter the search results, and you will not see anything profane on the first pages of the results. Google actually protects us from unfiltered search results. You have to physically go into your Google account, change the settings, and turn off filtering in order to have immoral images and websites like pornography websites or anything like that come up in your Google search results. That's not even how the internet works. Let me tell you something else. Many of these many sinful websites on the internet are run by companies that make their money off of all kinds of deceptive clickbait ads and things like that. Often when people get into these websites, there are these scripts in the website called cookies that register in your web browser and cause pop-ups to appear. Many times when people complain about, things quote-unquote popping up on their screen and acting all surprised, it's because they have already been voluntarily looking at things, which is what made these pop-ups possible. I can tell you I work on the internet all day and all night, and pornography or any immoral thing never pops up on my screen. So when people say that, it's simply not true. You may be using all kinds of shady websites. For example, if you're trying to basically do something like download a YouTube video, which you're not supposed to do, there are websites that will allow you to enter the YouTube video web address into this website, and it will download the video onto your computer. Well, those sites are almost always filled with bugs and viruses and other kinds of shady things, and that's where this kind of stuff gets into a computer. So you're already doing shady stuff on the internet to even get yourself into those situations. None of the common websites, if you go to a website like the Classical Liberal Arts Academy website, you're not going to have some kind of immoral pop-ups showing up on your web. That's not how the internet works. That's not how your web browser works. So this constantly blaming other people for bad experiences on the internet, when those experiences are often the fault of those using the internet, is, again, another false argument. And, the solution to this, of course, is supervision. So I want to defend, the reputation of these companies like Google that are actually doing the best that they can to protect all of us online. They are filtering search results so that immoral things don't appear when we search for different things. It was much worse 10 years ago or so because a lot of the filtering technology was still developing, and there are obviously evil people trying to promote immoral things. But the internet actually works against them. And like I said, if you wanted to test it, you would see that what I say is true. It's just how the internet works. So this idea that the bad guys are going to come and get you when you go on the internet to study something on a Christian website is simply not true. That's not how the internet works. And I just want to say that to defend the internet, because the people and the organizations developing things online actually do all that can be expected of them to protect us from unwanted distractions. And the accusations are simply false. So that's the second thing. No one is telling anyone to, quote unquote, put their kids online. And even if you do put the kids online, if they're supervised and they're using the sites and the pages that their parents give them permission to use, which again is all controllable to anybody who's not lazy about it, these bad experiences are not going to be had unless an idle, unsupervised child seeks them out, literally searches them out. And if you have a child that's doing that, as a parent, I would want to know that my son doesn't understand and cannot use freedom responsibly, because that's one of the chief duties of parenting, is to teach our kids how to use freedom responsibly. So if you see that if your child is given access to the internet and they immediately run to Google and start typing in profane search key phrases, well, you've got a problem to deal with, and it's not the internet's fault. The problem is in the soul of that child who is eager for evil things. And so it's not necessarily a bad thing to run into a problem where a kid does get caught doing something like that, because that could be a hidden evil in that child that needs to be known and dealt with. That's a separate issue. So much for that. Next, there's too much temptation and distraction. Now, it's worth noting that the people who complain about the internet are on the internet. So obviously, we have a couple of possible situations. A, they really don't believe what they're saying. They're trying to sound, virtuous while they do something that they claim is full of temptations and distractions. Let's assume that that's not what they mean. Secondly, they think that, they are able to control themselves, but their kids are not able to control themselves, which is true in most cases, which is why the kids have parents. So again, no one's talking to unparented children or unsupervised children. There are temptations at the mall. There are temptations and distractions at the grocery store. There are temptations and distractions as we drive down the highway. There are temptations and distractions at Mass on Sunday. Parents who are vigilant and responsible keep an eye out for these things, and they help their kids through them. They don't avoid Mass because there might be an immodestly dressed woman at Mass. They don't avoid traveling on the highways because there might be a strip club on the side of the road or some immoral billboard advertisement along the way. We don't avoid the mall because there's one store that sells, bad books or magic products or something like that. We use these things in common everyday life, and we simply direct our kids through them and protect them like shepherds do sheep. So this idea that what we do on the highway, what we do at the grocery store, what we do at the mall, what we even do at church can't be done on the internet is just another excuse. It's another excuse to not make use of resources that leave us with no excuse for our neglect of real Catholic studies. If it's okay for me as an adult to use the internet, obviously the evil that may be on the internet is not a necessary evil. If it was a necessary evil, then I would not be allowed to use it either. Like I said, I work on the internet all day and all night, and there's no boogeymen who pop up on my screen while I'm reading the Summa Theologica or sacred scripture or working on my classical liberal arts studies and fill my screen with immoral messages and images. It simply does not happen. So if these things do happen, it's because someone is visiting shady websites already and bringing things into their browser that shouldn't be there in the first place. Second, kids are not supervised. They're left to just surf the web, and they actively search for bad things. And if that's not the case, then I would really like for someone to explain what bad can actually happen when a supervised child uses the internet. What bad can actually happen? I'd like you to explain to me what bad would happen if a child signed up for studies in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy and accessed his account, accessed the study materials, accessed the assignments and quizzes. I'd like for you to explain to me what bad could happen to that student working to study online with parental supervision and so on. What bad could happen? There's no bad that could happen. And when bad does happen, it's not because of the internet or because of online studies. It's because the child is bad and because the child is not being supervised. And like I said, there are many ways to handle supervision. Limiting internet access to only times when it can be supervised, using parental controls to restrict the websites that can even be accessed. These things do work because I use them. I know that they work. You can restrict the internet so your child has access to nothing but the 2 or 3 websites that you approve as a parent. So the excuses blaming the internet for bad things, they're simply not true. So to blame the internet and not make use of the resources available is just, it's spiteful to yourself, first of all. And secondly, it's simply not true. It's not true. If you don't know how to use these things, well, that's a different story. And the right thing for you to do would be to ask for help or study to learn how to use them. Not spite everybody and just say, oh, well, I don't understand how these things work, so we're not going to use them. That's not very prudent at all. So no one is telling anyone to put kids online, whatever that means. No one says kids need to be online for the bulk of the day, as if there's no study schedule available for these kids. The argument that there's too much temptation is easily refutable because, what's the temptation? What's the temptation? The temptation is not from the internet, it's from other problems. And the internet's just being blamed. It's from idleness, for example. It's for negligence by the parents not supervising the kids. The evil is not caused by using the internet for Catholic studies. The evil has another source, and the parents are simply denying that other source. There's not too much temptation. If you're on the Classical Liberal Arts Academy website, there's no temptation to do anything bad or look at anything bad or hear anything bad. So that's not true. And then as for distraction, again, we're talking about online studies. If you go on the Classical Liberal Arts Academy website, what are the kids going to be distracted by? A sacred music radio station that they can play and hear sacred music? So is that going to distract them from their studies? Okay, maybe they'll be distracted by some sacred music, but I really don't think that that's going to distract anyone from studies. So what specifically are these temptations and distractions? Because I don't think they exist. I think they have other causes, and parents are simply not addressing those other causes, because the cause of those causes comes back often to the parent. And that's what the parents don't like. The parents don't like the idea of online studies because it requires supervision, because it requires good scheduling, because it requires an orderly study environment, and so on. I would argue that that's why the parents don't actually like online studies. It has nothing to do with any boogeyman attacking kids on the internet, because that's not how the internet works. So we're misidentifying the cause of the trouble and making excuses that spite our children so that we as parents can get out of the reasonable work of providing our kids with supervision so they can make use of thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars worth of the greatest study materials the world has ever produced in church history. Also, we can skip out on the duty of scheduling and supervision. That's spiting the kids. I would argue that that's the actual problem with online studies. Yeah, a parent who doesn't want to supervise the children loves the idea of having a box full of books, and the kids can just be let loose on this box full of. But what are these books? What are these books that the kids are let loose on? A dozen children's readers, a couple literature books. That's not a Catholic curriculum. That's not a study program. Are we going to buy some Catholic throwaway workbooks that are called a curriculum and think that our kids are safe because they really can't get into trouble with their Catholic homeschool workbooks? Well, that's true, but they're also not getting a Catholic education with those silly workbooks. They're not getting an education that's actually going to prepare them and teach them to handle freedom responsibly. And we're simply, burying our heads in the sand when we set up a homeschool and we sort of barricade ourselves into this little domestic Catholic fantasy land and ignore this giant flashing red sign that's saying these kids are going to have to leave home and make a living for themselves in the world when they're young adults. It's easy to simply turn away from that giant flashing sign and ignore it and just leave that for the kids to deal with when they're, suddenly yanked out of the house by adulthood. But I think it's better for us to actually understand what the challenges of that adult life are and provide the kids with an education that actually equips them to succeed in that adult life. And you're not going to do that by some cheesy workbook homeschool program, some cheesy box curriculum, some 1980s curriculum. It's not going to prepare your kids for what they're going to face when they enter into the real world workplace in the 21st century. And you can say, oh, well, our kids are going to become priests and monks and nuns. First of all, you don't know that that's true. I mean, it's probably like 80% of Catholic kids like to say they're going to be priests and nuns when they grow up, when they're young. But the reality is, even if they go to a college or a seminary or even if they decide they want to go and pursue the priesthood and go to, they still have to take college classes and things like that. And many Catholics, supposedly lose their vocation during the college years because they simply do not have a realistic commitment to that vocation that can overcome the temporary distractions of real life. They're not prepared to handle freedom responsibly. And they could even be, this happens in Catholic college environments. So this idea that the kids are all safe and everything is good, but the internet is dangerous, is contradicted by the reality that there have been no religious vocations for decades and decades and decades, not since the internet developed. And this Amish-like, retreat from the reality of preparing kids for adult lives in the 21st century and saying we're just going to get old-fashioned books and homeschool workbooks and give the kids and not let them access the internet, I would like for you to think of how the kid is going to react when he enters into that world as a 19-year-old with no supervision. Are you actually setting the kid up for more success in that environment, or are you setting the kid up to think he's strong, but never to have actually learned how to conduct himself, never developed the self-discipline to actually live in the presence of temptation, normal temptation, which is just a part of life in this world? To think that your children are going to move from your Catholic homeschool through some kind of underground tunnel into a monastery someplace, that sounds great if they choose to do that. But the statistics show us that Catholic kids are not choosing to do that. Catholic kids are not, these sheltered homeschooled kids are not choosing to all grow up and become monks and nuns and priests. So this argument doesn't bear itself out with the actual results of homeschooling. So yes, it would be very easy for me to simply ignore the real challenges that I have as a Catholic father in raising my children. It'd be easy for me to just ignore the challenges that I know are awaiting them in early adulthood and just ignore them and leave that to be their business. But I don't think that that's responsible parenting. We know what those issues are. We know what the temptations are going to be. When they enter into adult life and are free to make their own choices, we know what the temptations are going to be. And it's very likely that the temptations are going to overwhelm them initially, and they're going to have to, go through the shock of all of that secular culture. They're going to have to experience some of it for themselves. They're going to have to work through those things and see that they really are empty and vain. And they're going to gain their own experience and learn to begin resisting those things because they're not what they appear. But we're not helping these kids by simply pretending that there's a happy little Catholic fantasy world out there for them to go into once they finish with their homeschooling. That's not true. I don't think that that's responsible on the part of parents. Kids have to learn that many of these things are not intrinsically evil, but they're simply not profitable for us. They don't bring us any benefit. And kids have to learn to choose to do things or not to do things based on what they could be doing instead. That ultimately becomes the healthiest and surest motive. The reason why I don't sit around watching football games on television at night is because I have better things to do that I would rather do. It's not because watching football is bad. It's because I simply have better things to do with that time. And that's true of all recreation and entertainments. There are a lot of things I could do that are not necessarily sinful, but they're simply not as good as other things that I could do with that same time. And ultimately, in our adult lives, that's what determines what we do and don't do. We simply choose to do things that are better. And so our kids need to learn that discipline while they're under our control, while we are supervising them, while we are helping them. They have to learn that. Sometimes they have to fall into a rut in order to experience what it feels like to be in that rut and then get out of it and not want to go back into that rut. It's like playing sports. When you play sports and win, sports are fun, but you really don't understand how fun winning is until you lose. And then when you get on a losing team, for example, and no matter how hard you play or how well you do individually, your team still loses, and you get to feel that experience of losing. You learn to appreciate being on a winning team again with other good players and a better culture and so on. And our kids often need to experience that. They're born into a Catholic home. They're born into Catholic culture where their parents love them, where people are nice to them, where their church members love them and are kind to them. People are nice to them. Faith formation teachers are nice to them. Other Catholic parents are nice to them. Other kids are nice to them. They're born into this nice, safe, comfortable, loving, religious society, and they don't believe that people outside of that society will hurt them. It's impossible for them to believe that. And when they're sheltered, what happens is they begin to doubt what their parents say, and they don't really believe that the people outside the Christian circles are dangerous. And they have to learn that by experience, little by little, that what mom and dad are telling them is not some kind of fantasy. It's real. And in a normal childhood that's managed responsibly by parents, where there's a balance of sheltering, which is obviously a necessity, that's why they have parents in the first place. There's a necessity for sheltering, but within reason, because too much sheltering doesn't allow a child to grow in strength. This is true in any area of life. It's true in any area of life. Children have to be made to stand on their own feet. They have to learn to resist bad things on their own. They have to learn to say no to things. They have to learn to use their time wisely. It can't be mommy and daddy blocking them from any opportunity to have to learn to make those decisions. They have to be allowed to make those decisions, and many times they're going to fail in those decisions. And then they have to learn how to recover when they fail in those decisions. That's part of parenting. That's part of parenting. That's part of the Catholic life. That's why when our children are young, we teach them about the sacrament of reconciliation. We teach them the act of contrition. We teach them how to confess their sins and make restitution, because we know that they're going to sin. That's not a question. It's not a question of whether or not our kids will sin. Sinning is going to be a part of their entire life until they die. Dealing with the sin is a part of the Christian life, and we teach our children how to react, how to recover, how to be reconciled when they sin. And so you see, we're teaching our kids and preparing them for when they sin, because the fact that they're going to sin at different times in their lives, it does not mean that they then lose their salvation, especially when they're young and they're learning. So this is more complicated than just imagining that when your child was born, and again, this is the false thinking where these ideas come from. Thinking that when your child was born, he was born as this pure, glass of water, this pure, pristine, fresh water with nothing bad inside. And your job as a parent is to never allow anything bad to get into that water. That's not what a human child is. That's not what a human child is. A human child is not a blank tablet or an empty, or a glass of fresh, clean water. That's not what a child is. A child is born in sin. The sacrament of baptism takes away the guilt of that sin, and it establishes the child in a relationship with God where the child has access to God's grace. but the inclination to sin remains with your child as a part of his human nature. And therefore, we have to learn and teach our children how to live with this inclination to sin. We are always going to have to live with it. We have to learn how it works. We have to learn how to control it, and we have to be exercised in these things. If someone wants to learn how to box as a sport, there's a time where you can be taught technique and you can talk about boxing so much, but eventually the trainee has to get in a ring and practice boxing, and he's going to get beat up because that's part of learning how to box. That's part of learning. And we have this bizarre idea that we're going to keep our kids from ever sinning, and that's the way of salvation, when that's not the way of salvation. Do we want our kids to sin? Obviously not. But our kids have to learn how to fight against temptation. They have to learn how to resist temptation. And that's not the same thing as running unnecessarily into occasions of sin. That's something different. That's something different. Voluntarily entering into an occasion of sin means that you go into a situation knowing that you're going to sin when you go into it. That's entering into an occasion of sin. A good example of that would be drinking alcohol. If a kid chooses to go to a party and there's going to be alcohol and he intends to drink alcohol and he chooses to go to the party, he enters into an occasion of sin. That's why when people are drinking under the influence, they get hit with harsh penalties under the law, because they voluntarily entered into the condition which put them at risk of doing all kinds of evil. They entered into the occasion of the sin voluntarily. That's why speeding will get you ticketed or cause you to lose your license, even if you don't cause any harm, because you've entered into a situation where nothing good can come of that situation. That's not the same thing as learning to fight against the trials that are necessary and normal in this life, and learning by experience to overcome them, to understand them, to gain prudence in things by learning about your enemy. The way to defeat your enemy is not to avoid him at all costs. The way to defeat the enemy is to engage with the enemy and learn little by little how to defeat him in this battle. That's why the church is called the church militant. Not the church in retreat or the church in hiding. It's the church militant. It's a church at war. And if we're raising kids, to use this metaphor of war, if we're raising kids for war, how do we not make them go through training exercises to prepare them for battle? My kids are in the military. They go to basic training and are run through the harshest, most humiliating exercises and drills imaginable to prepare them for the mental and physical rigors of military responsibilities and duties. They don't join the military and move into a beautiful hotel and have classes and have, nice soft clothing given to them, or they're moved into barracks. They're given military uniforms. They're made to do push-ups in the mud, in the rain, in the cold. They're gassed with poisonous gas in a gas chamber to teach them how to fight and how to handle all of the different tests and evils that they could face in a time of war. That's how we train soldiers. So if the church is a church militant, how do we learn to fight against the enemy if all we're going to do is constantly hide from it and retreat from it? That's not how we learn to be strong. And this idea, which again is reasonable. I have kids. I love my kids. I don't want any of them ever to suffer, but at the same time, I know that there's some times when it's good for them to suffer. It's good for them to suffer. It's good for a kid to get hurt in a controlled environment so he can understand the importance of a lesson that he's been taught. It's good for a kid to fall down and scrape his leg because he didn't listen to the instructions he was given, because now he learns to take them more seriously. It's good for a kid who's arrogant and boasts a lot to get punched in the nose to learn that other kids aren't going to let him talk that way. It's good for kids sometimes to get what they deserve and to face the enemy and to deal with the evil and to learn by experience to understand the warnings that their parents are giving them about the world, because the goal of the parents is not to protect them from all evil, but to teach them how to overcome evil with good. That's a totally different responsibility than simply retreating and hiding and pretending that these things don't exist. That's not responsible parenting. And again, I'm not talking about irresponsibly or recklessly putting kids on the internet all day. No one is saying that. There's no need to exaggerate what's being said. And the fact that you need to exaggerate to make your point should be a red flag that your point's not actually valid. There's no need to exaggerate what's being said. Everything is being said in the context of parental supervision and scheduling and so on. They're being recommended to Catholic studies on the internet, not to surfing the web, not to going on wild Google chases all over the place. The content is controlled. And if the children are supervised, and if the schedule is responsibly arranged, I'd like you to explain what the dangers actually are of online studies. What are the actual dangers? I don't think that they exist. I think the problems that exist when kids are on the internet are caused by other things. Parents not supervising them, the kids being left idle without a schedule for long periods of time rather than for short, object-focused times to get things done, and so on. The problem is not the internet. The problem is idleness, and lack of supervision, poor scheduling, and so on. So I wanted to respond to this because I think that there are a lot of kids, I know that there are a lot of kids who are losing the opportunity to enjoy the richest and best Catholic education because their parents are making excuses to not allow them to pursue those studies through online courses. And it's simply a position and an argument that's dependent upon false assumptions, exaggerations, false dilemmas, and so on. It's not based on any demonstrable truth. Like I said, explain to me what the evil is of studying online. And I challenge you to do that in the comments. Explain to me what the evil is that's to be feared if a child studies online, let's say in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. What evil can happen to that child? I'd like you to explain it specifically, not through generalizations and assumptions or hypothetical situations. Explain to me specifically what the dangers are of a child studying the Catechism or the Bible or Latin grammar or Aesop's fables on the internet with parental supervision in a homeschool environment. Explain what is the danger that could happen to these kids, because I think you're making excuses to stay in a place as a parent where you are comfortable ignoring the challenges that lie ahead for your children. I don't think you're preparing your children responsibly for those challenges. I think you're burying your head in the sand and hoping that You never have to deal with any of the disturbances of the problems and the trials that you know are a necessary part of your children's lives, which they will have to face at some point. You might be able to delay that and push it off and push it off and push it off, but you're not making it go away. I would like you to explain to me, what evil does a child have to fear in online Catholic studies unless the parent is not doing his or her job as a supervising, scheduling, responsible parent? I don't believe there are any such problems. And I think this is an excuse by parents to simply ignore the reality of the challenge of Catholic parenting and pretend that all is well because we're simply ignoring the real issues. We're simply ignoring them. It's like if there's a leak from a ceiling in a bathroom, and you notice that the ceiling is leaking and there's a dripping onto the floor in the bathroom, and you decide just to lock that bathroom door and just not let anybody see it or talk about it, and then walk around the house day by day pretending that everything is fine and you're a responsible homeowner. What's going to happen is the damage that's done in the end will likely be much worse than it would have been had you taken up the responsibility and dealt with the problem that you knew was coming. And this is what many Catholic parents are doing. The idea that we're going to raise these cute little flowery saints in 21st century America are not realistic. This fantasy world, social media, photo opportunities, suburban life that parents want to pretend they're going to have is simply not reality. These kids face terrible temptations and confusions, delusions awaiting for them in their adult lives. We have to prepare the kids for those things. We can't simply lock the door and ignore them and just pretend we don't hear the dripping, because it's coming. By having our kids learn to handle these freedoms and privileges responsibly, by working with them through the mistakes that they make, the bad decisions they make, learning how to recover when they've made a bad decision or sinned, and so on. That's part of the work of Catholic parenting. And simply trying to avoid that because it's exhausting and difficult and frustrating, it really challenges our love and concern for our children, that we'd be willing to put our own comfort aside in order to help our children grow and learn and improve when they go through these difficult times. We're simply putting off the trouble and leaving it for our kids to suffer at a later time, so we can say, I brushed my hands clean of this because you're 18 now. Go deal with it on your own. That's really not loving. That's not fair for the kids to just be pushed out the front door as adults to face a world that their parents didn't prepare them for. And that's what we often see happening in the lives of Christian children. Their parents made it easy for themselves, and they pushed off the trouble for the kids to handle on their own as young adults when they're in their most vulnerable circumstances. I would argue even more vulnerable than when they're young children, because of the pressure of having to earn a living and provide for yourself, and kids are thinking about finding a spouse and all these different things. Those pressures are so intense and difficult. To just ignore those things and play house with your little kiddies like you live in the Shire in some Tolkien fantasy novel is just not responsible parenting. So I'd like you to explain to me, what is the danger in online studies that provide your children with access to the philosophical studies, to the grammatical studies, to the mathematical studies, to the humanities studies, that will actually help them to prepare for the complexity and the difficulty of the adult life that's ahead for them. I'd like you to explain to me what the dangers actually are, because my argument is the only danger is that the parents don't want to be bothered with the challenge of supervision or dealing with kids and helping them learn to actually live according to Christian principles in their lives. So that's my challenge. That's how I feel about this issue, and that's what brings me back to what excites me about the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, is that we make the best Catholic studies ever available in history, which have only been available to a tiny number of usually wealthy children, available to anyone in the world who has something as simple as internet access. It's a time for us to enjoy great success in Catholic studies, and I think that these excuses from parents are going to cause a lot of harm that there's simply no excuse for, because the remedy is available. It's available conveniently, it's available affordably, and they're simply making excuses not to use it. That's my position on this question. If you disagree, if, like I said, if you can identify a specific evil that is to be feared with online studies that isn't actually caused by parental neglect or failure to supervise the kids, I would like to know what it is, because I really don't see what those temptations would be, and that's with a family of 10 children. So let me know in the comments. If you have any other thoughts you'd like to share, please get in touch, and we'll try to continue this discussion, which I think is an important one. God bless.